So I see that a couple more people have hopped on, which is great. Thank you all for joining us. Just please be aware that we are recording this call for future reference, and you will receive a link to this recording and all our slides after this event. So I have here a very general timeline of tobacco. I've left in America. I've left a lot of stuff out. Obviously, there's a pretty big jump between these three. Just for context, some of these things we'll be talking about in some of our later sessions. And I also have some discussion questions that Deanna Rochelle, our education manager, has also put in the chat. If you can't see them, I think it may have gone in the chat before you logged on. So Deanna, if you could send that again, just so that it's at the top of everyone's message. So no wrong answers, just leave your answers in the chat so that I can see, we can get our discussion going. Okay, so I see Kaylin has said people wanted to migrate for religious freedom. That's definitely a factor, especially in Maryland. You can tell someone is upper class because people know about them or they're famous. That's very true. Clothes, money, food, access to materials, finery. Yeah, these are all things that let us know someone's upper class in the 18th century. Great answers. Okay, so I see Franklin has said, sorry, I was just admitting folks. Oh, poor economic conditions in England. That's a good answer, definitely. Franklin said land and a better life, some for religious reasons, money and publicity for question number 2. Let me click back to it. Outward wealth and land for question number 3. Those are all great answers. Land is definitely a big factor. And we're going to be talking about this, but you need, especially in the Chesapeake, you needed a lot of land to grow tobacco based on the colonial agriculture system. So I see a couple more people have logged on. So just as a reminder, we are recording this and you will get a link to the video and a copy of all of our slides. So after that, please feel free to drop any thoughts in the chat and please go ahead and answer these discussion questions in the chat. Again, there are no wrong answers. It's just to get us thinking. Our education manager, Deanna Rochelle, is monitoring our chat right now. And we're going to hear from her a little bit later. Let's see, I think we have almost everyone. Oh, great. Yeah, I was just about to say, it seems like everyone's logged on. So we are going to start right on time then. Terrific. Thank you all for being punctual. I really appreciate that. Okay, well, it's just about 7, so thank you all so much for being here today. You're going to hear from me first for about 20 minutes or so, and then I'm going to hand it over to our guest archaeologist, Jim Gibb. There will be parts where I ask you to leave your thoughts in the chat, and you're encouraged to make comments in the chat or observations if you'd like. But if you have any serious questions, I'm going to ask that you hold them until the end. I'm seeing Marion commented in the chat for question number 2 that people are literate. And that is a very good point. Literacy has definitely been a status indicator for a lot of history. Okay, so like I said, you're going to hear from me for 20 minutes. Then we're going to hand it over to our guest speaker. And then at the end, we are going to have a short Q&A. So please hold your questions until then. Like I said, maybe I didn't say, my name is Kate McGowan. I'm an educator here with the Accokeek Foundation, which is in Piscataway Park. The park is open if you'd like to visit, and we have a number of virtual events happening the next few weeks. Piscataway Park and Southern Maryland as a whole is the traditional home of the Piscataway people. And the Piscataway people have lived in this area and cultivated tobacco for thousands of years, as long as anyone can remember. And many still live in the area today and still cultivate tobacco. So the next installment of our series is going to be taking place on November 10th. And that's going to be a scientific study of sotweed. And we're going to be taking a more scientific look at tobacco. If you haven't already signed up, you can do so on our website. And here's our full list of upcoming events. Okay, so moving on to tobacco. I actually want to start with this image. So these tobacco bags, they're not from the 18th century, and they're not from the Chesapeake region. These were actually created by either an Osage or a Cheyenne artist. And the Osage and the Cheyenne are both Plains cultures, as I'm sure many of you know. And the reason I wanted to start with this, even though it seems like it might be totally unrelated to what we're talking about, is that these bags are obviously very beautiful, and somebody's obviously taken a lot of time to create them. There's a lot of fine handiwork. You don't really need to be an expert to see that. And the reason I wanted to include that is because tobacco, long before any Europeans came to America, was a sacred and ceremonial plant to a lot of indigenous cultures all across what's now North and South America. And I think it's easy to lose track of that when we're talking about people making a lot of money from tobacco. But I think it's really important to remember that this is something that has tremendous cultural significance to a lot of people and still has that cultural significance today. We're going to talk about this a lot more next month, but I did want to mention it now just because I think it's something very important. All right, so we are talking today about sort of the last half and the last third of the 18th century and before that, because during this time, America went from being a colony to being a country, but it's also a time where plantation agriculture is sort of being perfected and expanded westward, which means that chattel slavery is expanding westward and more indigenous peoples are being forced out. Now we're still several years out from the antebellum deep South cotton plantations that we've seen in a lot of media. But a lot of those ideas really started during this time. So tobacco country, that we're going to be talking about is really the area south and east of the fall line, which is about right here, in Maryland and Virginia, along the Chesapeake Bay and the navigable tributaries off the Chesapeake Bay. And this area was ideal for cultivating tobacco because goods could be easily shipped along the navigable waterways. In this part of the colonies, tobacco is king. Tobacco is the de facto currency, really, in the form of tobacco notes. Now, this is from the Maryland Gazette, and you can see that somebody is either offering to sell or hire out their prized horse for cash or tobacco. Both Maryland and Virginia established a system of tobacco warehouses to inspect all exported tobacco, and towns sprang up around these warehouses. Before we can talk about the 18th century, though, we need to talk a little bit about the 17th century. The early days of the American colonies were a lot more egalitarian than Britain during the same time, and more egalitarian really than the 18th century. Honestly, this could be its own talk completely, but to make a really, really big simplification, in the early days, there were a lot of new people moving in, a lot of people dying, and a lot of land that could be taken, which was really the extreme opposite of the conditions in Europe at the time period. So it really shook up the long established social order from England. And for many families during the 17th century, farming was more about survival than it was about profit. But a couple things happened between the 17th and 18th century that changed the social structure of the colonies. The biggest was the transition from an indentured servitude system to a system of chattel slavery. The first Africans who were forcibly brought to the Chesapeake were treated similarly to European indentured servants. Not the same, but similarly. They weren't necessarily in bondage for their whole lives, and they could own land and property of their own at the end of their bondage. This is another big simplification, but white landowners realized that it was easier to take advantage of Black workers who were less likely to be able to read and write in English or be familiar with English law. And a series of court cases in the mid-17th century gradually made their status as slaves permanent and race-based. At the same time, migrating to America became less attractive to people in Britain. Those that did migrate favored newer colonies, such as the Carolinas and Pennsylvania, because there was more land for the taking. And those that did migrate would often come to the Chesapeake, but then move to the far western parts. All of this led to natural population increase, which meant that most of the population growth was due to people being born in the colonies rather than people migrating in. This was true for both free and enslaved populations. And multi-generational families developed, and fewer new faces in the colonies came around. So people began to socialize with more of the members of their extended family, and people increasingly handed down their assets to their children. All of this going on, there were also crazy booms and busts in the tobacco market, which made it so that wealthier planters could consolidate their land holdings, and in turn, they sought out more enslaved laborers to work on the land. All of this created a system with an elite class of planters at the top, the gentry, and then small landholders beneath them, tenant farmers, free people of color, and enslaved workers at the bottom. So, what makes the gentry the gentry? This portrait of the Washingtons is pretty famous. It was created by Edward Savage and was copied in engravings, but I think that it's a really good indicator of gentry values of the time period. So what I'd like you all to do is I'd like you to take a second to look at this painting and let me know, leave in the chat, your observations about how you can tell the status of this family. Oh, I'm seeing a lot of good answers. Clothing, the globe, the map, the clothes, the servants, the black man's face is obscured. Yeah, that's a really good observation. They're obviously having a leisurely experience. The map of DC, that's a really great observation. You must be familiar with this painting or watching this on a really big screen. Let's see what else. The floor, yeah, the curtain. The fact that the whole family was painted and not just their faces, that's another good example, yeah. Faceless black servant, yeah. Great answers, great answers. Okay, so obviously the biggest factor was owning a lot of land and enslaving a lot of people to work that land, and being able to pass that land on to your descendants. So some of the figures here are for individual plantations, and some of them are for total land holdings. But you can see that it's really quite a lot of land. Wealthy men, you can see that George Washington owned 50,000 acres overall. I think that's actually slightly less than what he owned at the end of his life, but that's because a lot of wealthy men would buy up land in the far west too, far west meaning like Ohio. And they would also, rent land to tenant farmers and own multiple land holdings nearby. But also, as I mentioned before, tobacco farming required a lot of land because they wouldn't really fertilize the land. They would just move on to another part of the land. So they'd want about 20 acres per enslaved worker. So while some landholders small landholders would enslave people, what set the gentry apart was having enslaved people to be domestic servants. So a lot of you noticed that this man, who I believe, we're not sure who he is, but he's possibly William Lee. Again, we're not sure. He's dressed very finely. He's clearly tending to the family personally and not doing agricultural work. Someone else, Charles Carroll, mentioned right here. Charles Carroll had at least 11 enslaved people working for him personally as servants across his two homes. Another big factor for the gentry were social relationships to other gentry families, especially within the family. As rich people like to hang out with other rich people. That's not unique to the 18th century, and marrying well was really important to maintain status. So I've listed some notable examples here of important marriages, but Nellie and Washi, who are George Washington's adopted step-grandchildren, their mother is actually also related to the Calverts, just as a tidbit. So these relationships had political and business implications because the gentry would participate in local government and were able to pursue mercantile activities. Only white landholders could vote, and by participating in government, the gentry could protect their interests. Education was also key. Ooh, my education slide disappeared. But education was also key. Gentry families could afford tutors and private schoolings for their children. Young wealthy men could go off to universities in the colonies or go abroad where they'd interact with other gentry men. And educated planters might spend their time debating at social events, writing letters and pamphlets, keeping up with culture and politics from across the colony and Europe via local newspapers. And of course, conspicuous consumption was obviously a factor. A lot of you honed in on that. Luxury goods could be ordered from Europe. This could be anything from books and home furnishing to wallpaper, food and clothing. And all of those are especially important when you have wealthy, powerful guests coming over. So I took these pictures personally, but this is the Mason family silver over at Gunston Hall. And this is reproduction wallpaper from the period. We don't know that George Mason had that wallpaper, but that's wallpaper that would have been available. And I wanted to include this recipe from American Cookery because it incorporates quite a lot of expensive ingredients. So what does that mean for everyone else? Smaller landholders owned land, obviously, and enslaved people, but not to the same extent that the gentry did. Many small landowners were sons of wealthy planters, and so they were closely related. They could participate in government, and they had the capital to participate in some conspicuous consumption. Tenant farmers were reliant on the gentry to rent land. There are some examples of tenant farmers utilizing enslaved labor, and those who did not own land couldn't vote. And now I want to come to this painting. This painting is very different from painting of the Washingtons. It depicts a group of enslaved people on a plantation from the 18th century. What do you notice in this painting that's cluing us into their status? Or even just observations that you find interesting in general. Yeah, that's a great observation, Shamika. It's just them in their community. There are no white people in the picture, and that's really rare for this time period. There are many. The housing and the clothing is definitely different from in the portrait of the Washingtons. It's more intimate, yeah. Less detail in the faces. Oh, the instrument, yeah, that's a great observation. Also the fact that they're not wearing shoes, those are great observations. I think I read online that this is like an early prototype of a banjo. This is really not my area of expertise, but it's apparently like very noteworthy for that reason. The redware pottery, also a good observation. That's not fancy at all. They seem livelier than the static Washingtons. Yeah, that's a really great observation. This was painted by an amateur, they believe, and the Washington portrait was painted by a professional. But obviously the Washington portrait, and this is, other people have made this observation, but they look very wooden. It looks like a guitar the farm used to have that was made of a gourd, yeah. Oh, where did the painting come from? We're not sure. There are theories about who painted it. It was possibly a plantation owner, but I believe it's in collections at Historic Williamsburg right now. All right. So enslaved people were very subject to the whims of those at the top and the boom and bust of the tobacco market. And their lifestyles could be very different depending on where they were enslaved. Obviously, at a larger plantation, you'd have a community, but that wasn't necessarily the case if you were one of the only enslaved person at a farm. Enslaved people rebuilt their family networks when they came to America. At the same time that white kinship ties were forming, but their families could be forcibly separated. And as the colonies expanded and chattel slavery expanded, the risk of their families being separated only grew. So this is from the Maryland Gazette. I know that it's pretty difficult to read, but the key takeaway here is that a man named Bob escaped enslavement, and his enslaver is offering 2,000 pounds of tobacco as a reward, which I think is almost what one worker could expect to produce in a year. So in this book, American Husbandry, which was published in London, the author describes the costs of growing tobacco in great detail, and he calculates how much tobacco production would cost if labor cost the same as it did in England. And what he concludes is that just the cost of labor alone to produce tobacco would outweigh a person's earnings from tobacco. So it was very obvious, even at the time, that no one could afford to not even be wealthy, just profit off of large-scale tobacco farming without enslaving people. There would literally be no luxury, no profit, no leisure without the work of these enslaved people. And I think, I mean, that's really the important thing to remember here. So obviously the people that I've been talking about were some of the most wealthy and powerful people of the day. But beyond that, these relationships didn't just go away during the 19th century. As the plantation model of agriculture grew and expanded, that social structure was built on in other parts of the South. And a lot of the descendants of these families went on to be prominent people in US history and around the world. Businessmen, politicians, and many of them have even married into nobility. And this style of farming and land ownership seriously altered our landscape and how and where we live today. So these are just a handful of notable people who are descended from wealthy tobacco planters of the colonial period. And with that, I am done, and I am so pleased to hand it over to our guest archaeologist, Jim Gibb, Director of the Smithsonian Environmental Archaeology Lab.
Can you hear me? Okay. I have to figure out a way of sharing my slides. I don't see the, oh, share screen. There we go. Well, hello, everybody. I hope everybody can hear and see this well. There we go. So we're talking about tobacco. A friend of mine once described the Chesapeake tobacco culture as the first drug culture, because the whole point was to produce a drug for retail, and we did that really well. But more than that, tobacco culture is a way of producing wealth from the land and then turning that wealth into something fungible and storable. That is, take tobacco, which won't last forever. You have to sell it and use it pretty quickly, and turn it into preferably cash, which you can save and invest and store forever. So, well, what I'm going to do, I'm going to be talking about sort of an archaeological perspective on all this. And before I begin, I want to provide a few concepts. It's going to take a few minutes, but I don't have time to talk about how we do archaeology, how we find sites, and that sort of thing. We can always do future talks on that. But the three major concepts I want to look at are scales of analysis, how we distinguish between change and variability, and what's this material culture stuff all about. For scales of analysis, we're looking at three basic things. Settlement pattern, which is how people distribute themselves across the landscape. House lot patterns, which is what do individual house lots look like. And dietary patterns, which occur within house lots. How do people make food and prepare it? And how do the diets of one household differ from those of another? What does that all mean? Our emphasis in archaeology tends to be on households because that's the site. That's what we dig up rather than individuals. Can distinguish between change and variability. These are important concepts, and particularly to make the point, which I'll reiterate, nothing changes because of the passage of time. Time is simply a dimension, just like space. And then material culture is interesting because you can tell that people are wealthy by the kinds of houses they live in, the kinds of things they own. But more than that, that material culture is what those wealthy people use to express their wealth and their education, their sense of fashion, their education. So these are some of the things we'll talk through fairly quickly. In terms of settlement pattern, we have a 1797 map here, and it has several orders of settlement on it. So we have Annapolis, which is a large town. We have London Town and Upper Marlborough, which represents small towns. And then we have these small hamlets like Queen Anne and Pig Point, both on the Patuxent River. Each level has different size populations, different mixtures of trades, public and private institutions, etc. And then we'll have a whole bunch of landings, which I've only suggested one, which is where Smithsonian Environmental Research Center is. But there are a whole bunch of landings along the navigable waterways where there might be a store, that is a storehouse really, and not much else. And then of course you've got plantations all over the place. For instance, the buoys up here. And also this map shows the chapels and churches across the area. In the first order, the large towns, here we have Annapolis, 1718. We have design motifs. I mean, there's a series, two major circles with radiating streets as well as gridded streets. We have major institutions. At the public circle is the State House, of course. Church circle is St. Anne's, both still there. And then we have all sorts of merchants and tradespeople and other public and private institutions. With a smaller town like Joppa, which is in Harford County now, but used to be the county seat for Baltimore County, they set aside a piece of land divided up into lots that people could purchase. One large lot saved for the church, one for the courthouse and the prison. And this actually has the old prison, and then also has a new prison down here. But these lots would be purchased by people. The rights to those lots would be purchased. And they'd set up mercantiles. They'd have stores, warehouses, some trades like smithing, cooperage, and that sort of thing. To the right is, by comparison, the county seat of Charles County in 1674. And it's really an unusual document. I think we have one other that I'm aware of for Calverton. That's about 10, 20 years later. But it has the courthouse, the stocks where you put bad people and throw tomatoes at them. We have an ordinary, it says PL Ordinary. So this is the inn of Philip Lyon, as I recall. Some houses, orchard. This is basically, what this is a plantation that happens to have a courthouse associated with it. And the house, the plantation house, also serves as an ordinary when court is in session for a few weeks out of the year. This is a schematic map of Port Tobacco. The town of Port Tobacco now is up in this area here. And this side of the map, these are actually two separate maps. This one just shows the distribution of Aboriginal sites dating back 5,000 to 6,000 years. And I have it in here partly because it's part of the slide and I didn't have time to change it, but also it shows we found these archaeological sites in plowed fields. So these ancient sites survive. So we can assume the historic sites, the much later sites, survive as well. On the right-hand side, same base map, these red ellipses each represents an 18th century site. None of them predates 1720. None of them postdates 1800. This, meandering down the creek, this used to be all open and navigable here until around the Revolutionary War. This was the town stretched out along the creek. And what you see here, we'll see in the next slide, a close-up. This is the town starting probably, certainly by the 1820s and certainly in this case by 1888. Each of those gray polygons represents a building that existed in 1888. Those that are bounded with a red line are those that either survive to this day or for which we have archaeological evidence, just based on the limited work done so far. So we went from a community stretched out along the creek, probably merchants and ordinaries, they probably houses that served both purposes when the tobacco fleet was in, to a formal year-round town. This version is where you generate a lot of capital. Money is accumulated from the tobacco crops. It's consolidated and invested and loaned out at interest. And what do tobacco farmers do to secure loans? They secure loans with land and slaves. Those are mortgages. One last scale of analysis is, the individual, and here you could see this bone handle found in a shell midden, trash midden. Here it is close up. It has inscribed upon it, THO for Thomas, Sparrow. We didn't actually find it at his house site. We found it at his neighbor's house site, the Shaw site. But this is from sometime in the late 1600s. These are bottle seals on the right. They each have the initials of the owner, who, ordering wine bottles back in Europe, would have his initials molded and then essentially welded onto the side of the wine bottle while it was being made. So the top one, it says IS, but it's a Latinate I, so it's actually J. It's probably for James Skinner. And it was found at the Roberts site in what's now Prince Frederick. And GRB for Gustavus Richard Brown, recovered from Port Tobacco, and that dates sometime around 1780. We're not going to deal with individuals because archaeologically we rarely can attribute any one artifact or group of artifacts to a person. In terms of change and variability, change is movement through time. So if the adoption of motor vehicles is what I use as an example, hardly anybody had any in 1900. Lots of people had them in 1940. That is a change. There are all sorts of reasons why people adopted automobiles, but the passage of time is not the explanation. Again, it's simply the dimension along which change occurs. Variability, if you pick the year 1920, some people had cars, some people had trucks, some people had horse-drawn vehicles, some people had a mixture. Some households had no form of transportation, or maybe a horse. That's variability. Variability is important because it's a source of change. When pressures develop, when something occurs, certain people are going to adapt to those changes better than others because they're already adapted for it. They already have the wherewithal to deal with those changes. And just as sort of a simple model of some of this, we can go back 1,000 years, actually 1,000 years before the Common Era. Aboriginal occupation begins long before that. But this is a simple conceptual graph, and what I'm suggesting is with these blue polygons is that there's very little variability on different sites of the period as we go through most of Aboriginal history. And even when Europeans first settled the area. But soon thereafter, introducing capitalism in the form of tobacco agriculture, we get a lot of more variability among sites. We get lots more sites and they start to look a lot different from one another. So we get to the present and, my house, I'm sure looks very different from your house and it looks very different from your neighbor's house. That's variability. And I'm saying that a lot of that variability is caused or is a product of capitalism, which itself has been developing over the last several centuries. So those are the concepts. So let's talk a little bit about our findings in archaeology and general history. First of all, the society we're dealing with is profoundly rural in the 17th century. St. Mary's City is kind of the hub of activity, but even that was mostly during when the court was in session. It was probably pretty empty otherwise, unless ships were coming in, tobacco fleet specifically. The proprietary government tried to establish towns through a number of laws it passed with the General Assembly between 1666 and 1708 for several purposes. I mean, one thing is, of course, if you have towns and you force people to bring their trade to towns, it's a lot easier to tax them. But they also probably intuited that towns were a way of accumulating capital, which was necessary for expansion to invest in more tobacco agriculture and other activities. The folks who got here first and came with the most means tend to monopolize the superior lands along the coast. Good tobacco soils, largely sandy soils, right along navigable waterways, so it wasn't very hard to get their 1,000 to 1,200 pound hogsheads of tobacco loaded onto a vessel, a small sailboat that would take it out to larger ships anchoring the deeper water. As those lands became monopolized and as they were wearing them out from successive years of tobacco agriculture, the children of those original settlers and newcomers had to find lands in the interior, away from navigable water, often in less desirable land. And Calvert County is an excellent example of this. A lot of the interior of Calvert County is broken up and eroded. It's not really ideal unless you manage to monopolize a whole bunch of land and can lease it out to folks. With those plantations set up throughout the interior, you need a road system to link them to one another, to link them to these different orders of central places, the hamlets, the small towns, and of course the big town of Annapolis. Baltimore doesn't come along until later in the 18th century. And at those centers, you get repair service like the blacksmiths. You get merchants who not only can sell you stuff, but buy your tobacco, and they can loan you money. And again, for most of these folks, what they had to secure mortgages would be land and slaves. Earlier on, when your tobacco land wore out, you simply moved. You patented some other land. By the time we get into the early 18th century, that becomes pretty tough, and you have to not move around so much, and you have to constantly recultivate the same land, exhausting the soil. And what that means is not only removing nutrients, but also that land started washing away into local creeks. I've been working intensively throughout Maryland for the last 30 years or so, but in Charles County in particular since 2012, when the archaeological review was required for development. And my major finding after 8 solid years of doing archaeology in Charles County is that we've wreaked havoc on the land throughout history, and especially again in the 1920s, 1930s, when we started using motorized equipment to mostly plant tobacco and corn. And so it's really, we've lost a lot of archaeological sites, we've lost a lot of agricultural land, and we've lost a lot of navigable water. This map from 1673, it's actually a detail of a larger map of the Chesapeake by Augustine Hermann, who was a Bohemian, living mostly in New York and before moving to Maryland. But he made this map and gave it to Lord Baltimore, and you can see all these little dots along the shoreline. That is his way of saying that the settlement of the Chesapeake in around 1670 was largely coastal. You wouldn't use this map to actually find any sites. I think this is mostly symbolic. He notes some of the larger manors, Poynton Manor, Westwood Manor down here, but he also has some small hamlets, I think Chickamuxon and Nanjemoy, I think that's what that's supposed to indicate, and St. Thomas. but you also has Pamunkey Indian land and Piscataway land and other groups on this map. So it's very interesting, but it gives you a sense of what the settlement was like in the 17th century. Certainly by the mid 18th century, but even earlier, you get all these folks moving in, and you saw this map a few minutes ago. You need a road system that develops, that links these central places and links the plantations to those central places. Also, you can get tobacco and other crops, but principally tobacco, accumulate that at these central places so it could be shipped out, and so it could make a bunch of money. And in return, of course, manufactured goods come in, and you can leverage loans as well. So that's settlement pattern. We have two more levels of scales of analysis to go through. Looking at house lot variability, most of the early houses are very simple 2-room type structures. Some are just 1 room. But typically what's called a hall and parlor plan, which is a house is divided more or less in half. One half is what we would regard as a kitchen, but it's more general use than that. It was the central meeting place for folks. Various tasks were carried out there. Household member, family members, servants, slaves, neighbors, animals, everybody just kind of moved in and out of that space. And it was the principal heated space. That's where the hearth would be. The parlor part of the house is sort of the master bedroom. It may or may not be heated. That's also where the plantation owners would keep most of their wealth locked up in trunks and chests. By the early 18th century, we see increased variability, different kinds of buildings that seem to grow organically. So they just keep adding additions to them, specialized outbuildings, even separate quarters for slaves and servants. By the 1720s, and especially during the golden age of 1740s and 1760s, that's when we see the grand mansions. Now, all the earlier forms are still out there, and there are even log cabins all over the place. But this is the period when sufficient wealth is accumulated that we get the development of essentially an aristocracy. Putting on aristocratic airs, sort of like the Washingtons, not sort of, like the Washingtons. Building these very fashionable mansions with sculpted landscapes and all kinds of imported exotic plants, showing off not their sense of fashion or taste, also their knowledge of geometry, rules of perspective, botany, even references to classical literature. So some examples. This is from William Stevens Land, which is just north of the Patuxent River Naval Air Station in southern Calvert County. There were 2 sites there, about 800 feet apart. The earlier one was occupied by the William and Margaret Stevens, their 2 sons, John and something or other, and 3 servants. Each of these buildings, we think, is a dwelling. We think it's a dwelling because each of them has this chimney bay, this thin rectangle at one end that supported a hearth made of putting wooden posts in the ground, weaving branches among those posts like a big basket, and then plastering it over with mud, and that would be the hearth. So 3 of these buildings are dwellings. One just seems to have been some sort of storehouse. We have another, perhaps a shed over here, and some sort of animal pen down here. But these are all 1-room buildings. It may have been one was for William and Margaret, the other for their 2 sons, the other for their servants. We don't know. A little bit later, from the 1660s to 1680s, 800 feet away, we get the Patuxent Point site. And that's a classic hall and parlor house with a chimney bay. So it tells us that this is the hall, a parlor, and there's actually a hearth in here as well, some sort of closet attached to it, a 25-foot diameter pit just full of oyster shells and all kinds of neat trash, including a lot of bones that tell us about diet. And an ash-filled pit over here that I'm certain was a privy. And there were some posts around. This is probably an outhouse over here. So this is kind of the earlier forms. Over at Patterson Park and Museum in Calvert County, Dennis Pogue excavated the King's Reach site 30 years ago. And what he found was the footprint of a house, and this is an artist's reconstruction, but this would be the plantation house, again, a hall and parlor with cellars underneath both, a little dairy building addition on one side, a shed addition, a fenced-in foreyard, a couple of borrow pits, which is where soil was dug up, mixed with water, and used to plaster these chimneys, these wattle and daub chimneys. And then we have what he thinks is, and he's probably right, is a servant's quarter with its own little cellar and a hearth, and that would be the small building here. So the servants have a separate living quarter. They're not living in the main house, but they're living pretty close by. And that's a pattern that for the most part changed soon after, where servants and less servants and more slaves, more Africans, enslaved Africans, were put in separate quarters, often quite a distance from the main house, although usually within view of the main house. Cliffs Plantation, excavated by Fraser Nyman 40 plus years ago. And this is where Stratford Hall is now, where Robert E. Lee was from. But preceding Stratford Hall, we get, and this is just the latest phase of construction there. He's got archaeological evidence that this main dwelling here was expanded several times. A little addition over here, root cellar, a large kitchen with a cellar, additional buildings, fences all over the place, some additional buildings here, and graves. These would be the graves here of the planters, those people who had access to the wealth of this house, and further away from the house is where the labor was buried. As I recall, all but one of these were African. We had one European in the mix. So you can see increasing complexity and segregation of people based on their relationship to ownership of the plantation. So we're going to move on now to material culture. And I call it material culture as reflection and as assertion. You see this house here is Bel Air Mansion in Bowie, still there, wonderful place. A very impressive building. And it's hard to see from this photograph, but this is a terraced lawn that leads up to it. Very impressive. You take one look at this and you go, well, the Ogle family, they were wealthy. And yeah, no kidding, obvious enough. But this building is not only a reflection of their wealth, it's a way in which they asserted their right to be the leaders of Maryland. It shows wealth, power, fashion. This is very fashionable architecture for the period. The terraced gardens would have had all kinds of exotic plants, so knowledge of botany and rules of perspective, the way the gardens are laid out, geometry. I mean, they're showing they're well educated and they're up on fashion. And the 18th century elite, that was very important. And they did that not to impress people like us. I assume you guys are like me, kind of slugs. It was done to impress other elites. Because if you were one of these wealthy families, you want your children to marry well. So finding mates, you had to impress potential in-laws. You had to impress the leadership of the colony because that's how you got really plum positions like custom collector of the customs, where people collected the taxes and you skimmed off the top. So you made some pretty nice money for no real effort. The Ogles also had a place in Annapolis, which is still there, Ogle Hall. So they had a townhouse. And that also was very much part of elite life in the 18th century, made possible by the wealth extracted from the ground, mostly by slaves, but also by farmers, independent and tenant farmers, but accumulated and monopolized by the very wealthy. And so after the harvest, these folks would move into town for the season. If you read any Jane Austen or watched any of the Jane Austen films on PBS, you have a sense of what that's like. They get together during the winter holidays, they party, they make social connections, they marry off their kids, etc. And this is all made possible by the wealth they extract from the land. As I noted earlier, there are costs to the land for doing that, but that's another story. This is a LiDAR image, which is sort of like radar, taken from an airplane, but using laser instead of a different part of the EM spectrum. And it allows those pulses to go even through forested areas. And it allows us to create essentially a topographic map unimpeded by vegetation. Well, this is land that's part of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center now. There is a ruin at this point, which is this house, photographed in 1940. At that point, it's seen better days. But the important thing I wanted to point out here is you could see this rectangle that was created. This is not a natural landform. And essentially terraces or steps that are very evident here, not so evident here anymore, they've eroded, still a little bit evident here. So with slaves, they managed to create this landform, sort of like a large pedestal on which to put that impressive house. Again, like Bel Air, that's an assertion of power. That's not simply a reflection of wealth. It's a tool used to assert your rights to that wealth and your rights to political power. I'm ready now to move on to our last scale of analysis, and that is diet. And this is something I specialize in. Particularly, I identify and analyze bones from meals. This is a site that we just finished excavating just in Bowie, Maryland, just west of 301 and south of Maryland 50. And you could see we've got post holes all over the place, some possible buildings sketched out. We're still doing the analysis, so this is a work in progress. But you could see these large stippled polygons throughout the site. These are pit features. These are holes that people dug into the ground sometime between the 1720s and 1770s for whatever reason. And then those holes filled with trash. They probably weren't dug for trash. They were dug for other reasons, but they became convenient places to dump trash. Archaeologists, particularly those interested in diet, live for these things because they tend to be quite rich in dietary remains. Here's an example of one of these pits from another site near Davidsonville, early 18th century. And in plan view, when you scratch them down, they're just, kind of an amorphous, oblong type thing. But when you excavate them carefully, you end up identifying different lenses or strata. And each of those represents a short period in time. And many of them have dietary remains in them, burned plant materials, as well as bone and other artifacts that help us date them. What we do typically for a lot of archaeology is we screen the soil right on site. We have 1/4-inch mesh, we throw the soil in, we shake it, pull out the artifacts. But for these features, what we do is we excavate the soil, we bring them back to the lab, which at that time was my house, and we screen them, but we use window mesh inside the large screen. So we're washing the soil through and saving everything else. And then let it dry. You can see leaning up against the truck, these racks, they're drying off, and in each of them is some gravel, but also a lot of charcoal that we can identify plants from, and bone and some artifacts. Here are the guys, again, in the lab, also known as my kitchen. They're sorting out the material. And in this case here, this dish here is filled with burned beans, just the common bean. Somebody burned a pot of beans or something. We don't know why it's preserved, but clearly they're eating beans, among other things. Also from that deposit, we get corn and we get wheat, Triticum sativa. So it gives us some sense of the kinds of plants these people are eating. Wheat is important. We tend to think of these tobacco farms as growing tobacco and just enough corn to get by, to feed to the servants, feed to livestock. There were even a couple of laws passed in 17th century Maryland requiring planters to plant a certain number of acres of corn. Otherwise, they were afraid they'd starve to death because they'd grow nothing but tobacco, which brought in money. Corn didn't bring in money. A shot of just, kind of bone material that comes out of these features, pretty broken up. But my job is to figure out what elements are represented here and what species are represented, so we could figure out what they're eating. Fish remains, these come from an early 18th century site in Prince Frederick, up by the Armory. Fish remains, these are catfish and white perch. They're quite a few miles from the Chesapeake Bay, but these are two species that come up into the creeks into the shallow waters. So I think what they're doing is they're fishing locally, as opposed to those sites that are on the coast where they're bringing in rockfish, large rockfish, and other marine species. We can identify the remains of fish and mammals from various sorts of guides and a huge type collection. I've been collecting roadkill for the last 40 odd years. It's all at the Smithsonian right now. All clean, doesn't smell too much. But fish scales, you can tell what species of fish is from magnifying the scale, looking at the ridges and steni, and that is like a fingerprint. So we can identify species of fish. We can identify the mammal remains, again, from our type collection and various guides. And then we can take these schematics of animals, cow, pig, sheep over here, and color in those elements that are represented in a particular archaeological site. This happens to be from a slave site at Smithsonian. And it's a little misleading because those bones are incredibly fractured. They're really crushed up, suggesting these people are boiling the bones to get maximum nutrition out of them. So I'm going to just a quick example of how this works using two sites on the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center grounds. I don't know, 1,500 feet apart, contemporary sites. The plantation, tobacco plantation of John Shaw, and the tobacco plantation of Thomas Sparrow. And each of them has been excavated. Sparrow's Rest was excavated by Anne Arundel County's Lost Towns team. Shaw's Folly was excavated by our Smithsonian Environmental Archaeology Laboratory, otherwise known as SEAL. We are the SEAL team. And here's Shaw's Folly. This is part of our excavation. You can see this is a shell mitten that survived because this land wasn't really plowed with motorized equipment much at all. It was pasture land for cattle throughout much of the 20th century. So the shell mitten has survived, portion of it intact, and it's just loaded with artifacts and bones and whatnot. So examples, we got the right mandible of a pig, some fragments of cow bones, some fish remains here, left mandible from a cow, along with some oyster shell and some ceramic. Now we can compare these two colonial sites, both again 1650s to 1680s. The colors of these the chart, they're a little similar, but I think you could distinguish them. Here's white-tailed deer. This is just number of identified fragments of bone by species. We have like 3 deer bone fragments from a couple of thousand identified fragments of bone. These people are not hunting white-tailed deer. There's some turtles, some fish, a squirrel, a few sheep, some rockfish, and various sorts of wild animals. Some of these are just animals that died, a rat snake, for instance, probably just died in the deposits while burrowing in there. But the point of this graph is that these people really aren't doing much in the way of hunting and fishing or fowling. These are things to look at. Pig, cow. This is what these folks are eating. And it's pretty clear, I think, to most archaeologists working on diet in the region that English people, at least, coming over here, and there were other folks too. There were Scots who barely didn't speak English at all, French Huguenots, some Spaniards, some Dutch, but by and large, mostly English. And they were very interested in replicating what the diet they had back in the old world, or creating the diet they wish they had back in the old world, which is beer, white bread, beef, pork, mutton if necessary, and mushy peas. And we have evidence of the cultigens here. We have mushy peas at the Roberts site. We have wheat, presumably to make bread. So we're getting some sense of diet, but look at there's some variability here too. Here's pork and beef for the folks at Sparrow's Rest, whereas pork and beef are pretty much the same number of bone fragments identified at Shaw's Folly. And that suggests that Shaw's Folly, there was a preference for pork, and at Sparrow's Rest, a preference for beef. And that probably represents their livestock husbandry practices. So if you got some folks who are focusing on beef, some on pork, they're going to have different diets, and they're also going to have different impacts on the environment because the behaviors of those two species are very different. So they will alter the environment in different ways. Magnify that, start thinking about all the other folks doing different things, and you've got quite a mishmash. Just to show, in many ways, these two households were the same. We have window leads, that is the cames that hold windows together on these sort of medieval style or church style windows. When you pry apart the pieces of lead, you can see WM 1671. From Sparrow's Rest, same thing, WM 1671. And they have similar ones over at St. Mary's City. So these folks are dealing with the same merchants. They're getting their windows from the same place. Ceramics. These are type of ceramic from around Pisa, Italy. We call it North Italian slipware. Look at these fragments compared to these. You would be inclined to try to glue them together, but they're from two different sites. There's no way they're going to glue together. The same thing with these North Italian slipware fragments. They look identical, but they're from two different sites. So these two households were dealing with the same merchants back in the old world. And the merchants they're dealing with are going to be different than those, say, in Charles County or over in Delaware. And finally, I just wanted to kind of throw this in to talk a little bit about contested resources. You know, that wealth is generated from the environment through tobacco or agriculture. And you get, in this case, this is an early 18th century mansion house, so it's not the big fabulous thing like Bel Air, but still large and expensive. In the back of it, this is just west of Upper Marlboro, contractors knocked down the much later kitchen wing. And so we had the opportunity to do some excavation at the floor of that basement. So we've got 3 of our excavation units here, each about 5 foot by 5 foot. But this is the interesting thing over here. It's a pit. Somebody dug a pit in the bottom of the cellar. Now, why would you do that? You have a cellar. It's already a big hole in the ground. Why would you dig a hole within a hole? Here's an image of that hole. It's nearly 4 feet in diameter, pretty much round. And the black bits you can see are artifacts sticking up. They're wine bottles. And here it is, a partial excavation. You can see a wine bottle here, part of one here, part of a base here, a neck over here, and other artifacts as well, some examples of which Chinese porcelain, these 2 pieces, tap from a keg, and a tumbler, a glass that was too broken up for me to actually take a decent picture of, so I've created a wireframe model, 3D model of it. All this stuff is broken and buried in this pit, which should clue you in on why the pit's there. These are the 6 bottles that we were able to largely reconstruct so they could stand up on their own. But these are all the bottles. Again, we've created 3-dimensional wireframe models of each so we can actually calculate the volume and look at them statistically. But all this stuff is buried in a hole in the basement. And what it suggests is, one, we've got people, servants, almost certainly enslaved servants, who broke stuff and are hiding it so they don't get in trouble. And they may also be helping themselves to some of the produce of the plantation, essentially taking their share, if you will. And there's sporadic archival references to this behavior all up and down the east coast of the eastern United States throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries. So I just wanted to point that out. So here's sort of a summary slide. I don't want to read it all or anything, but tobacco culture developed in at the same time capitalism was developed. Capitalism was a fairly new economic system. It changed throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. It continues to change today. Capitalism in 1930s is not capitalism today. Capitalism of 2008 is not the capitalism of our present. It's constantly transforming. And so tobacco culture grew up during that process, and to a certain extent was part of that process of changing capitalism. Land was initially leased out for very nominal sums. Rent was cheap. But the thing to remember is, until the 1750s, there was only one landowner in Maryland, and that was Lord Baltimore. Everybody was a tenant. They paid rent twice a year and took an oath of fealty to Lord Baltimore. If they failed in doing either, that land, including the house, crops in the field, livestock, whatever, escated back to Lord Baltimore. Basically, you lost everything. So everybody was a tenant. that land became increasingly scarce when Lord Baltimore started selling land in fee simple, the last Lord Baltimore. You had to stay put. You couldn't move because the land was worn out. You simply cultivated it more intensively. You needed to do that generally to pay off a mortgage as well as meet expenses. So what we've documented archaeologically, and archaeology is a science, so we're in the business of documenting, of measuring things and looking for patterns. So we see a developing hierarchy of settlement patterns, which I've talked about. We see different house lot organization, different kinds of houses, organized, the space around houses organized differently, increased variability as we move through the historical continuum. And we also, this is something I'm working on now for a book, is that I think we get increasing variability in diet. And part of that depends on where you live. If you live closer to the main rivers and the Chesapeake Bay, you have a certain kind of diet, lots of shellfish, and we see that on the archaeological sites, lots of marine fish. Up in the interior uplands, more in the way of deer, more hunting is going on. Oyster shells are virtually absent. We do get fish remains, but they seem to be the kinds of fishes that you find in the upper parts of the streams in the uplands. And again, as I pointed out earlier, there's significant degradation of the land from tobacco agriculture. Before the American Revolution, we can document it's happening before the Revolution, where streams are silting up, choking off navigation. We have an unconfirmed quote from Patrick Henry of Virginia. He supposedly said, "He is the most patriotic who stops up the most gullies." That is, whoever fills in the most gullies created by stormwater and preserves the land, they're the most patriotic. We're just beginning to explore all this. There's a lot of sites to work on. There's a lot of data to analyze. So we're constantly revisiting these questions. There's no pat answers to any of it. Anyway, that's about all I had to say this evening. I'm sorry if I've tried your patience just a little bit. So I'm going to stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you so much for that. That was really great. And thank you everyone for joining us. I know we had a couple questions in the chat. So I think what would be a good idea for y'all is to set, if you haven't already done it, set it to speaker view so you can see the people speaking. And I believe Deanna's gonna jump in and read us some of the questions.
Hello, everybody. I'm Deanna. I'm the education manager at Academic Foundation. The first question that we have is from Abby. Actually, both of our questions are from Abby. I think this may be more directed at Kate. So she is asking about the 317 enslaved people at Mount Vernon. She would like to know if it was just at Mount Vernon or over the full acreage. And does it count towards the number of indentured servants that he had as well?
Those are great questions. So to start, I want to preface with George Washington is not the best example of the time period, even for rich people, because, well, for really a lot of reasons. He's not the average super wealthy person, I guess, if you want to put it that way. 317 enslaved people is really a whole lot, even among the wealthy people. I don't know off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure that there were no indentured servants at Mount Vernon toward the end. And indentured servitude really pretty much disappeared by the end of the 18th century. In part because at the beginning of the 18th century, landowners were still looking for preferred white laborers, in part because they thought that they were more familiar with European customs, so they felt like they could leave them alone unsupervised, that sort of thing. But that really shifted. So to my knowledge, I don't think that there were any. I'm sure Mount Vernon has that information on their website. And George Washington had 3 separate plantations at Mount Vernon that were sort of doing different things, but they were all sort of nearby each other, which was not necessarily the case for every rich person. So they were all at Mount Vernon, to my knowledge, but they were spread over a really big area. I think a lot of that acreage was out in the Ohio River Valley. Again, I didn't go through the land records myself, so I can't necessarily speak in depth to that.
Thanks, Kate. And this one is for Jim. So Abby is asking about the comparison between Sean's Folly and Sparrow's Rest. She's wondering, is the lack of chicken remains common at this type of site?
There are what I call yard fowl, because what we think of as chicken is to a certain extent a fairly modern invention. And a lot of what we have in the way of chickens nowadays is post-World War II. So there's kind of a variety of yard fowl that these folks would raise and feed, mostly kitchen scraps too. But we don't find a lot of yard fowl remains on most of these sites. I suspect, well, we do find, if the preservation is good and we do this kind of water screening approach I demonstrated, we find a fair amount of eggshell. So I think that's mostly what they're doing. They're raising fowl for eggs, not necessarily for meat. Chicken as a popular meat item really takes off in the 20th century in certain parts of the world, especially Europe, after World War II, because there's a fast, easy way of raising producing high protein in a land that was pretty devastated by the war. And that's when we get more of these specialized breeds of chickens. So to answer your question, colonial sites, we tend not to find a lot of yard fowl remains.
Interesting. And I have another question from Heather. It sounds like the gentry weren't actively involved in the heavy day-to-day management. Was there a middle management class coming out of the gentry's plantations, or were slaves or family entrusted with this work?
Would you like me to answer that?
Sure.
It really depended on how wealthy and personal inclinations of the household. You can read the diaries of William Byrd down in Virginia, and he clearly was not much interested in management of his plantation. He spent a couple of hours every morning reading Greek and Latin, and other planters. George Washington, his archive is replete with letters, especially when he was away being a general or a politician, letters to his overseer explaining what he wanted done, when he wanted done. The man was a real control freak. And lots of folks are just sort of in between, where they took, they managed things, but they often had overseers who sort of crew chiefs, as we would have in archaeology. You have your principal investigator who sits in a nice, comfortable office drinking coffee all day, and then you have some slug out there with the crew telling them what to do and making sure the work gets done. And that was probably pretty common amongst the wealthier folks. But the vast majority of farmers probably could not afford that. They were lucky if they could afford some slaves.
Thank you, Jim. And all right, another question just came in from Marion. Was Europe the primary market for colonial farms, or were other colonial towns or cities?
Excellent economic question, which reverberate. It's something that we need to look at today as well. Most of 17th and 18th century agriculture was for export to the UK. And from 1650 onwards, and they weren't supposed to be trading with anybody else. This is a mercantilist type economy. The colonies shipped their raw produce to the mother country. The mother country sent back goods with very little exchange of money, of coins, gold or silver coins. Now, some material, some stuff was shipped down to the sugar islands in the West Indies because they weren't producing any food. So we'd ship livestock and wheat and corn. With the embargo acts of the late 18th, early 19th century, as trouble brewed between England and France, and we were trying to stay out of it, we started trying to develop our own domestic economy. So we didn't rely on other countries. And we started investing, instead of investing in shipping, we started investing in wool manufacturers and cotton manufacturers. And that's the sort of thing that certain countries go through today. China right now is very much focused on trying to develop an internally domestic economy to control their economic fortunes better. And that's the same thing we were doing in the 18th century. We're trying to master our own economic destiny.
Thank you again, Jim. All right, I have a question from Yusuf. In Maryland, which remains from plantations show preservation of African culture?
I haven't actually, well, that's a really hard question that archaeologists have been dealing with since, I think, the late 1960s. It's easy when you work on an African site, a known African site. When you're working on a plantation site, every single artifact that we dig up was handled by an enslaved African. You can take that to the bank. Every building we're looking at was built by enslaved Africans. The cultivation, the harvesting, the curing of tobacco, all that, all done by Africans. So when we're digging plantation sites, we're really digging up enslaved African behavior. But to try to identify specific African cultural practices is very difficult, partly because planters discouraged, sometimes quite violently, discouraged those kinds of activities. They discouraged native languages, observance of religious beliefs. Remember, a lot of these folks were taken from West Africa. A lot of them were Muslim. A lot were animist. Few, if any, were Christian. And they're brought here. Those religious communities are broken up. And so to the extent that any religious education occurs, it's going to be Christianity. The house styles they were used to were not permitted. And we have one example down, I think it's South Carolina, a famous one, where the archaeology suggests these folks were building West African style houses. But within a generation, those were razed. And the new slave quarters were more along European models with brick piers and frame construction, that sort of thing. Now, there are folks at the University of Maryland, Mark Leone specifically, and his students, they've been looking at evidence of African ritual practices in terms of burying certain kinds of artifacts in certain parts of houses that they did not own, that their owners owned. And some of that evidence looks pretty good. Some of the other evidence is less firm, and it's hard to really establish some of this. But we're still out there looking for African behavior. But it's important to realize that when we're excavating these plantations, Africans have their fingerprints over everything.
Sometimes literally in bricks, right? And Marion suggests possibly Solderly.
I visited Solderly and I've talked to the folks there. I know they've got one or two reported slave houses. Some archaeology has been done there. I really don't know much of what's going on. I think Julie King or Liza Gigante at St. Mary's City might know more about that than I do.
To that.
Something that I just like to jump in and add, the painting that I showed everyone, the old plantation, that we don't think was painted in Maryland, but something that is notable in that painting is that there are a lot of African cultural elements, like the gourd stringed instrument. A lot of scholars believe it's a molo. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, which is a part of Yoruba culture. And it is a precursor to the banjo. I had to look it up. And holding what looks like sticks or broom handles. I will send you all a link to look at this picture in the follow-up email. But a lot of West African traditional dances involve sticks. A lot of the headdresses that people are wearing have African influences. So we do know that African cultural influences obviously have been preserved, even if we're not necessarily finding them in the archaeological record, I guess is my point.
Yeah, that stuff doesn't preserve under most conditions. We're really stuck with that which preserves, and it's like looking at a galaxy through a keyhole in a door. And it's very difficult, but it's what we got. It's what we work with.
Shamika is saying that Satterley does have one of the last, if not the last surviving slave house in Maryland. So yeah, we'll have to look into that. I have a question from Kaylin. She is asking, can you touch on how the gentry engaged in tobacco production and trade? And did they produce tobacco, or did they purchase tobacco from smaller farmers and sell that overseas?
That's an excellent, good question. The gentry, I mean, they own the land. They own the plantations that are producing tobacco. So they have control over that crop. They decide who their agents are going to be and what part of the world. Some of these folks had agents in Glasgow and Edinburgh, not just London and Liverpool and Bristol. They decided how that wealth from that tobacco was going to be used. As the tobacco would be shipped, they'd also ship orders of, we want certain kinds of ceramics of this kind of pattern, a set of 12 or whatever. We want, this item and that item. So they would make those decisions. I think for the wealthiest, the largest planters, they often served as intermediaries for the smaller farmers who just produced so little that, a farm might just produce one hogshead of tobacco, some 800 to 1,200 pounds. So it would be easier to include that with the shipment of the local gentry. And also the local gentry would order a bunch of stuff and store it in the cellars of their houses or in separate storehouses. And at certain times of the year, or maybe all year round, served as kind of stores for, I need such and such, so I can go down to the store at the local gentry's plantation and buy what I need or buy it on credit. You will notice Bel Air Mansion's a great example of this. You go into the basement, it's got this vaulted ceiling and various rooms. It's clearly meant for storing a lot of stuff. And I don't mean just a lot of port for the family. And just a lot of goods were kept in there. And that had to be used to feed both the workers, but also probably sold to local small planters.
Thank you, Jim. And it is about 8:23, so I think last call for questions. But I do have one from Abby. She's asking, was there evidence of clay tobacco pipes found at the sites in rural Maryland? If so, are there enough remaining maker marks to see where they were imported from? That's a great question.
Tobacco pipes we find lots of them. I should point out first that I worked on a couple of sites where we didn't really, maybe small scale excavations, mostly surface collecting, where we found few or no tobacco pipes. So, there might be some exceptions out there, but typically we find a lot of tobacco pipes. At the Patuxent Point site from the 1650s through 1680s, we excavated the family cemetery that was there. And we found men, women, and children. And on the teeth of men, women, and children, we found these circular facets worn through the teeth, from clenching clay tobacco pipe stems in their mouths. So we know men, women, and children all smoked, at least at that period. Some of those people probably died from it because they developed abscesses that may have, the infection may have gone to their brain and killed them. So smoking does kill. Don't smoke. We do find a lot of tobacco pipes. Not all, a relative few are marked with maker's marks, and it tends to be a fairly small number of types that show up at any one site or any group of sites in a particular area, but a lot of them can be traced back to pipe makers in the West Country of England, Bristol area, some to the Netherlands, for probably sites in the 1650s. Later sites, Scotland and even Ireland. But the vast majority of pipes we find, at least the fragments we find, don't have maker's marks on them.
Thank you, Jim. And I believe the last question for the night is from Marion. She says it's interesting about smaller households, how they would produce one hogshead versus the multitude that the gentry would produce. Was the gentry just the 1%, meaning most households were small?
There was in the 1970s and 80s what we call the Chesapeake Mafia, and there were a bunch of historians. There were social historians that knew social history that was very, very much in vogue at the time, who collected a huge amount of statistical data from probate inventories and all kinds of sources, and analyzed the stuff. They've written a number of books. Gloria Main, for instance, is one of them. And I just don't remember all that stuff. What percentage you would consider the gentry? A relatively small percent. Let's take that for granted. And those gentry, as I think Kate pointed out, were also the ones who became, elected sheriff, elected to General Assembly, elected to the vestry that chose the minister, collected taxes to support Church of England. So I couldn't tell you what percentage. 5% sounds like a good starting place anyway. I guess we just have to reread those books. Alan Kulikoff is another one.
Having looked at the probate records for local to our region, the Piscataway town, I couldn't give you a number either, but it's definitely jarring, I guess, even knowing going in that a lot of people didn't own very much. I think sometimes it can be very jarring to read and see, oh, it really is not a lot of stuff that a lot of people own. Like, I think one of the houses, it was one spoon is listed. Maybe Deanna can correct me on this. Maybe it was one fork. One fork makes more sense. One fork, for the family, one fork. So that kind of thing, it's a very, very wide gap, I think, between sort of regular folks and the gentry. Again, I couldn't give you an exact breakdown of what percent of the population fell in each place, knowing that being near the Chesapeake was advantageous, would probably have an impact on it, but it's a pretty wide gap, yeah.
I could tell you that in my office where I'm sitting now, the room is about, 18 by 15, something like that. There's more stuff in this office than you would have found in any of those mansions. So even for the very wealthy in the 17th and 18th centuries, they just didn't have the material goods we have today. They were expensive. And they were just beginning to develop this interest in acquiring such things. We live in a consumer society, especially American society. Our economy comes and rises and falls with how much we consume. That wasn't true in the colonial period. And most farmers, most households out there, I probably have more stuff in my truck than they would have had in their entire house. From a material culture perspective, you could say they were impoverished. On the other hand, most folks probably had the basics of what they needed. And one thing, a caveat I want to point out with the probate inventories, where scholars have analyzed room by room what objects were in each room at the time a person died. Some neighbors would come in, do an inventory, and figure out how much was all worth. One of the historians has found in Annapolis from, I don't know, 1670 through 1720, something like that. Half the households, according to probate inventories, had no ceramics. Now, if that's true, archaeologists are in a lot of trouble because we live and die with ceramics. That's how we find sites, that's how we date them. My guess is that it depended on who was doing the inventory. And a lot of the men probably intuited that the kitchen stuff belonged to the widow. Now, under law, that's not true. Everything belonged to the husband. When they married, everything belonged to the husband. But I get the sense from these inventories that they were making that kind of judgment that this is women's stuff, it belonged to women. And by the way, probably had, because of that, had no value in their minds. So probate inventories and other sources do have their limitations, and we have to consider those when we're generalizing.
Thank you, Jim. And Kate, I believe that's all of the questions that we have in the chat. So I will hand it over to Kate for closing remarks.
Again, thank you all so much for being here with us and for your insightful observations and questions. We will be sending you all of the slides